May 1940, the Grand Harbor, Malta. The heat in Valletta was not simply a temperature, it was a physical weight. It pressed down on the limestone ramparts of the ancient fortress city, baking the dust and turning the air into a shimmering haze. In the middle of this blinding Mediterranean glare, the British Empire was waiting for salvation. The war was no longer a distant rumor. Italy, led by Benito Mussolini, was posturing on the brink of conflict. The Regia Marina, the Italian Royal Navy, was spooling up its turbines in ports just a few hundred miles to the north. They had built a fleet designed specifically for this water. Fast, elegant cruisers and battleships that looked like works of art as much as weapons of war. To counter them, the British Mediterranean fleet needed steel. They needed modern interceptors. They needed the best the Empire could offer. What sailed into the Grand Harbor that morning did not look like the best. It looked like a mistake. There were 5 of them, entering in a line, their gray hulls stained with the salt of a long, hard voyage from Singapore. They were destroyers, but they lacked the predatory sleekness of the modern age. They were boxy, sitting low in the water, with thin funnels and clutter on their decks. As they maneuvered toward their berths, the sound they made was not the high-pitched hum of modern turbines, but a rhythmic, metallic clatter. They groaned, they squeaked, they rattled. These were the HMAS Stuart, Vampire, Voyager, Vendetta, and Waterin. They were Australian ships, manned by Australian crews, but their bones were British, and those bones were old. They belonged to the V&W class, a generation of destroyers built in the desperate final years of the First World War. In 1917, they had been the apex predators of the North Atlantic, designed to hunt the Kaiser's U-boats in the freezing fog. But naval technology moves at a ruthless pace. By 1940, a ship built in 1917 was not just old, it was an antique. It was like bringing a musket to a machine gun fight. To the observers on the shore, British officers in crisp white uniforms, Maltese dockworkers, and undoubtedly Axis spies watching from the tea shops of Valletta, the arrival of these ships was almost pitiful. It was a sign of weakness. If this was what the British were sending to hold the most vital sea lane in the world, then the war was already lost. But the observers couldn't see inside the ships. If they could, they would have understood the true scale of the handicap these men were facing. The most critical deficiency was the hull construction. Modern warships of the Second World War were welded. Welding created a smooth, seamless skin of steel that was relatively flexible and watertight. These Australian destroyers were riveted. Their hulls were held together by hundreds of thousands of steel pins, hammered into place by hand 20 years earlier. Time and the sea are cruel masters. After 2 decades of steaming through tropical monsoons and Southern Ocean gales, the rivets were tired. When the ships hit heavy weather, the hulls didn't just flex. They worked, the plates ground against each other. In the mess decks, the sound was a constant, nerve-wracking screech, like a heavy iron gate being dragged over concrete. And they leaked. They leaked from the bottom, they leaked from the sides, and they leaked from the decks. The bilge pumps were the heartbeat of the ship. If the pumping stopped, the ship sank. Then there was the heat. These vessels had been designed for the North Sea, engineered to keep warmth in. In the Mediterranean summer, they became steel ovens. The temperature in the engine rooms frequently exceeded 140 degrees Fahrenheit, 60 degrees Celsius. There was no air conditioning. Ventilation consisted of canvas wind scoops stuck out of portholes to catch a breeze. The stokers, the men shoveling fuel and managing the boilers, worked in conditions that were medically dangerous, often fainting at their posts, only to be dragged on deck, doused with a bucket of seawater, and sent back down. And finally, the weaponry. The Italian fleet was equipped with centralized fire control computers and high-velocity guns. The Australian destroyers were fighting with the naval equivalent of a revolver. Their main armament, the 4-inch guns, were breech loaders. They were not automatic. Every shell had to be hauled up from the magazine by hand, carried across a heaving, wet deck, and rammed into the gun by sheer muscle power. For anti-aircraft defense in a war dominated by the airplane, they had almost nothing. They had bolted Lewis machine guns to the railings. These were infantry weapons from the trenches of 1918. The idea that a drum-fed machine gun could stop a modern dive bomber traveling at 300 miles per hour was optimistic to the point of insanity. It didn't take long for the enemy to notice. In Berlin, the Nazi propaganda machine was monitoring the Mediterranean buildup. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, was a man who understood the power of words. When he received the intelligence report about the arrival of these 5 elderly ships, he saw a golden opportunity to demoralize the Allies. He took to the radio waves. His broadcast was heard across Europe, and crucially, monitored by the radio operators on the ships themselves. With his characteristic sneer, Goebbels told the world that the British Empire was finished. He claimed that London was so desperate, so devoid of resources, that they were scraping the bottom of the barrel. Look at what they send to fight the glorious Axis forces, the propaganda broadcasts mocked. They have sent a load of scrap iron. It was a brutal insult. It was meant to tell the sailors that they were disposable. It was meant to tell them that their lives were worth nothing, that they were being sent to die in floating coffins, just to buy a few weeks of time for the real Navy. The German and Italian admirals laughed. They dismissed the flotilla as a non-threat. They expected the scrap to rust at the pier or be sunk in the first week of combat. But Goebbels had made a fatal error. He had judged the ships, but he had ignored the men. The crews of these destroyers were not the conscripts of a decaying empire. They were volunteers of the Royal Australian Navy. They were a strange breed, culturally distinct from their British cousins. They were drawn from the sheep stations of the outback, the surf beaches of Sydney, and the hard streets of Melbourne. They were tough, cynical, and famously disrespectful of authority. In the Royal Navy, an officer was a god and a sailor was a cog. In the Australian Navy, discipline was maintained, but the social barrier was thinner. The men were fiercely loyal to their captains, not because of the rank on their shoulders, but because of the competence they demonstrated. When the news of Goebbels' insult filtered down to the mess decks, the reaction was not what Berlin expected. There was no drop in morale. There was no fear. Instead, there was laughter. The Australians loved it. They saw the humor in the truth. They looked around at their leaking pipes, their cockroach-infested galleys, and their rattling engines, and they nodded. "He's right," they said. "We are scrap iron." But they took the insult and weaponized it. They adopted the name instantly. They weren't the 10th Destroyer Flotilla anymore. They were the Scrap Iron Flotilla. It became a badge of honor, a perverse sort of pride. It lowered expectations. It freed them. If they were just junk, then they had nothing to lose. They could take risks that a shiny new cruiser would never dare. The leader of this motley pirate fleet was Commander Hector Heck Waller, the captain of HMA Stuart. Waller was not a man who looked like a hero. He was quiet, unassuming, with a receding hairline and a calm, schoolmasterly demeanor. But behind that mild exterior was one of the most aggressive tactical minds of the war. Waller was a sea dog in the truest sense. He could feel the vibration of the ship through the soles of his boots. He knew exactly how much strain the old rivets could take before popping. He knew that in a fight between a heavy pugilist and a scrapper, the scrapper has to get in close and fight dirty. Waller gathered his captains. They knew the odds. They knew the Italians had better ships, faster engines, and bigger guns. But Waller had a simple philosophy: aggression. If you see the enemy, you attack. You don't count their guns. You make them count yours. On June 10, 1940, the waiting ended. Benito Mussolini stood on the balcony of the Palazzo Venezia in Rome and declared war on Great Britain and France. The Mediterranean turned from a blue highway into a killing zone. The Regia Marina sortied immediately. Their strategy was to strangle the British supply lines using their massive fleet of submarines. Italy had over 100 submarines at the start of the war, more than twice as many as Germany. They fanned out across the Mediterranean, silent killers waiting for the convoys. The scrap iron flotilla was thrown into the deep end. They were ordered to patrol, to hunt, to keep the sea lanes open. The first test came almost immediately. It was HMAS Voyager, under the command of Lieutenant Commander James Morrow, that drew first blood. The Voyager was on patrol off Malta when the lookout spotted a disturbance in the water. A periscope. It belonged to the Italian submarine Varsciek. Hunting a submarine in 1940 was more art than science. The Voyager was equipped with a SDIC, an early form of sonar, but it was primitive. It gave a bearing and a range, but it required a skilled operator to interpret the pings and distinguish a submarine from a school of tuna or a thermal layer in the water. Morrow didn't hesitate. He ordered the Voyager to attack speed. The old ship shuddered as the engineers opened the throttles. The fans in the boiler room screamed, forcing air into the furnaces. Black smoke poured from the funnels. The Voyager surged forward, her bow cutting through the swell, the rivets groaning in protest. They ran over the contact. Fire! The depth charges were launched. These were not precision weapons. They were oil drums filled with high explosives, set to detonate at a specific depth. They rolled off the stern rails and were thrown outward by the key gun mortar. The sea behind the Voyager erupted. Massive domes of white water rose into the air, followed seconds later by the sickening crump of the hydraulic shock wave hitting the destroyer's hull. The dust was shaken from the overhead pipes in the wardroom. Light bulbs shattered. They turned and attacked again. And again. They didn't sink the Varsciek that day, but they battered it so badly that it was forced to abort its mission. It was a message. The scrap iron was not hiding in the harbor. It was hunting. Days later, the Voyager confirmed her lethal intent. She located another submarine, the Consul General Liuzzi. This time, the hunt was relentless. Morrow tracked the sub for hours, pounding it with depth charges until the Italian captain, his vessel cracking under the pressure and the air running out, was forced to surface. As the submarine broke the surface, the Voyager didn't wait. Her gunners, manning the old 4-inch breechloaders, opened fire immediately. They didn't need computers. They aimed by eye. They raked the submarine, forcing the crew to abandon ship. The floating coffins had claimed their first victim. But hunting submarines was only the prelude. The real test, the test that would determine if these old ships could survive in a modern war, was coming from the surface. In July 1940, the Italian battle fleet moved. 2 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and a swarm of destroyers moved to intercept a British convoy. Admiral Andrew Cunningham, the British commander, took the Mediterranean fleet out to meet them. The collision course was set for the coast of Calabria, near the toe of Italy. It was to be the first clash of battleships in the Mediterranean since the time of Napoleon. M.A. Stewart, Vampire, and Voyager were there. They were sailing in the screen of the British aircraft carrier Eagle. As the purple outlines of the Italian fleet appeared on the horizon, the men of the scrap iron flotilla looked at the size of the enemy guns, and then at their own thin steel plating. They were about to enter a storm of steel that should, by all rights, send them to the bottom. But Heck Waller wasn't planning on surviving. He was planning on attacking. July 9th, 1940, the Aegean Sea off Calabria. The horizon was no longer empty. It was crowded with the silhouettes of giants. To the north, the Italian battle fleet was deploying in a line of battle that stretched for miles. The flagship, the battleship Giulio Cesare, looked like a floating fortress, her massive guns traversing slowly, hunting for targets. Flanking her were heavy cruisers of the Trento and Zara classes ships that were faster than anything the British possessed, armed with 8-inch guns that could pulverize a destroyer with a single hit. On the bridge of the HMS Stuart, Commander Heck Waller watched them through his binoculars. The distance was closing. The air was heavy with the smell of funnel smoke and fear. The Australian destroyers Stuart, Vampire, and Voyager were stationed on the flank of the British fleet. Their job was to screen the aircraft carrier Eagle. Ideally, a screen stays out of the way when the heavyweights start punching, but war is rarely ideal. At 3:14 p.m., the Italian heavy cruisers opened fire. The sound was a dull, rolling thunder that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Seconds later, the water around the British cruisers erupted. Towering columns of white water, dyed green by the explosives, rose high into the air. The Italians had found the range immediately. The British Admiral, Andrew Cunningham, saw the danger. His own cruisers were outgunned. He needed to blind the enemy. He looked at the destroyers. The signal flags ran up the halyards. Make smoke. It was a suicide order. To make an effective smoke screen, the destroyers had to place themselves between the enemy and their own fleet. They had to sail closer to the Italian guns, deliberately drawing fire to create a wall of opacity. Waller didn't blink. He ordered the Stuart to full speed. The response from the engine room was a cacophony of metallic protest. The engineers opened the valves wide. The fans screamed. The old ship, built for the leisurely convoys of the First World War, began to vibrate so violently that the compass repeater on the bridge blurred. She surged from 20 knots to 28, then 30. Vampire and Voyager followed her. The 3 scrap iron ships charged toward the Italian fleet like terriers rushing a pack of wolves. As they turned broadside to the enemy, the order was given to start the smoke generators. Thick, oily, white chemical fog began to billow from their sterns. It was dense and acrid, choking the men on the aft decks, but it worked. It began to smear the horizon, hiding the British ships behind a curtain of artificial cloud. But the Italians were not blind yet. They saw the 3 insolent little ships rushing them. The Italian gunners shifted their aim. Suddenly, the Stuart was sailing through a forest of geysers. The 8-inch shells from the Italian cruisers were landing all around her. The noise was deafening, a series of cracking whips, followed by the roar of displaced water. Shrapnel pinged off the thin steel hull like hail. Waller stood on the open bridge, exposed to the flying steel. He was calm, almost detached. He was chasing the splashes. He knew that gunners rarely correct their aim to hit the exact same spot twice immediately. So when a salvo landed off his port bow, he steered toward the splash. It was a terrifying game of chicken, played with 1,500 tons of steel. The Australian gunners fought back. They manned their open mounts, stripped to the waist, sweat pouring down their backs. The decks were slick with salt water and oil. They loaded the 4-inch guns, rammed the breeches, and fired. Crack, crack. They were firing at ranges where their shells could barely scratch the paint of the Italian cruisers, but the aggression had an effect. It confused the enemy. The Italians, seeing the ferocity of the counterattack, hesitated. They couldn't believe 3 old destroyers would attack so recklessly unless they had a trap springing shut behind them. Then the British battleship Warspite found her mark. A 15-inch shell struck the Italian flagship Giulio Cesare from 13 miles away. A hit was catastrophic for Italian morale. The Italian admiral, fearing he was walking into a disaster, ordered a retreat. The enemy fleet turned away behind their own smoke. The Stuart, Vampire, and Voyager emerged from the battle scorched, shaken, but afloat. They had stood in the line of fire against one of the most powerful surface fleets in the world. They had protected the Eagle, and they had survived. The German admirals, who had called them scrap, were silent. But the Italians were learning that the Australians were crazy. The months that followed were a grind. The war settled into a rhythm of convoys and patrols. But in March 1941, the stakes were raised again. British intelligence, utilizing the primitive computers at Bletchley Park, had cracked the Italian naval codes. They knew that the Italians were planning a massive sortie to destroy British troop convoys near Greece. The entire Italian fleet was coming out again, led by the new battleship Vittorio Veneto. Admiral Cunningham set a trap. He took the British battle fleet to sea under the cover of darkness. He needed eyes in the night. He took the 10th Destroyer Flotilla. He took the scrap iron. The Battle of Cape Matapan began on March 28, 1941. It started with airstrikes and confusion during the day, which left the Italian heavy cruiser Pola dead in the water as night fell. The Italian admiral, unaware that the British battleships were racing toward him, made a fatal mistake. He sent 2 more heavy cruisers, the Zara and the Fiume, back to tow their crippled sister. Night fell over the Ionian Sea. It was a moonless, ink-black darkness. In 1941, the Italians had no radar. They were sailing blind. The British battleships, however, had primitive radar sets. At 10:25 p.m., the trap snapped shut. The British battleships Warspite, Valiant, and Marham detected the Italian cruisers on their radar screens. Range, 3,000 yards. Point blank. The Stuart, leading the destroyer screen, was right in the middle of it. Waller felt the tension. He could see the dark shapes of the enemy ships. Then the British searchlights snapped on. The beams of white light cut through the darkness, illuminating the Zara and Fiume. The Italian guns were trained fore and aft. The crews were on deck preparing towing cables. They were completely defenseless. The British battleships opened fire. The violence of the salvo was apocalyptic. The 15-inch shells tore the Italian cruisers apart before they could even rotate their turrets. In minutes, the majestic ships were reduced to burning wrecks. This is where a normal destroyer captain would pull back. The big ships had done the killing. The enemy was destroyed. It was dangerous to be anywhere near the burning hulks. Heck Waller did not pull back. He saw chaos, and he saw opportunity. Hard a starboard, he ordered. We're going in. The Stuart charged straight into the center of the burning enemy fleet. It was an act of disciplined madness. The water was choked with debris, burning oil, and survivors. Italian destroyers were darting through the smoke, trying to launch torpedoes at the British battleships. Waller turned the Stuart into a street fighter. He spotted an Italian destroyer fleeing the scene. Open fire. The Stuart raked the enemy ship with her 4-inch guns, setting it ablaze. Then, looming out of the smoke, came the burning hulk of the Zara. She was a floating inferno, but her guns were silent. Waller circled the dying giant. He fired his torpedoes into her to finish her off. But in the confusion of the night, the Stuart was moving so erratically, dodging collisions and hunting targets, that she terrified her own side. The captain of the British battleship Valiant saw a destroyer rushing out of the smoke on a collision course. He assumed it was an Italian attacker making a suicide run. The massive turret of the Valiant swung around. The 15-inch guns lowered. The Stuart was seconds away from being vaporized by friendly fire. Waller, realizing the danger, grabbed the signal lamp himself. He didn't send the formal code. He flashed a frantic, personal message into the eyes of the British gunners. I am Hector. Don't sink me. The Valiant held her fire. The Stuart peeled away, diving back into the smoke to find another victim. For an hour, the old Australian ship ran wild. She engaged 3 different enemy ships. She fired every shell in her ready-use lockers. She acted like a terrier in a pit of bear's nipping, biting, distracting, and causing absolute panic among the remaining Italian forces. By dawn, the battle was over. It was a massacre. 3 Italian heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers had been sunk. More than 2,300 Italian sailors had perished. The British had lost 1 aircraft crew. The Stuart emerged from the smoke as the sun rose. She looked terrible. Her paint was blistered from the heat of the burning ships she had passed. Her decks were covered in soot and spent shell casings. Her crew was deafened, exhausted, and covered in grime. But as she steamed back into formation, the crews of the British battleships, the Warspite, the Valiant lined the rails. They didn't cheer for the Admirals. They cheered for the scrap iron. They cheered because they knew what those men had done. They had taken a ship built for a different war, a ship that should have been razor blades, and they had driven it into the heart of a modern fleet action. Maritime was the high-water mark of the surface war. The Italian Navy never truly recovered. They never challenged the British for control of the open sea again. But the war was changing. The era of fleet battles was ending. The era of attrition was beginning. While the Stuart was winning glory at Maritime, a disaster was unfolding in North Africa. The German Afrika Korps, led by the brilliant Erwin Rommel, had launched a lightning offensive. They had shattered the British lines. They had pushed the Allies back hundreds of miles across the desert. By April 1941, only 1 fortress remained in Allied hands. The port city of Tobruk. Rommel surrounded it. He cut off the road to Egypt. He brought up his artillery and his dive bombers. Inside the perimeter were 14,000 Australian soldiers, the famous Rats of Tobruk, along with British and Indian troops. They were trapped. They had no food, no water, and their ammunition was running low. Rommel was confident. He believed they would surrender in a week. He knew that no ship could survive the gauntlet of German air power needed to resupply them. The coast leading to Tobruk was lined with German airfields. It was nicknamed Bomb Alley. The British admirals looked at their charts. They looked at their precious modern destroyers. They couldn't risk them. The loss rate would be too high. So the call went out again. "Send the old ones," the command said. "Send the scrap iron." The glory of Maritime was over. The nightmare of the Tobruk ferry was about to begin. This was not a battle of tactics. It was a battle of endurance. The ships Stuart, Vampire, Voyager, Vendetta, and Waterin were stripped of everything non-essential. The torpedo tubes were removed to make deck space. They were turned into high-speed trucks. The mission profile was simple and terrifying. Leave Alexandria at noon. Steam at full speed into the teeth of the German Air Force. Arrive at Tobruk at midnight, in pitch darkness, under artillery fire. Unload 40 tons of ammunition and food in 1 hour. Load hundreds of wounded soldiers. Depart before dawn catches you. Do this night, after night, after night. The ships were already falling apart. The rivets were leaking. The engines were worn out. Now, they were being asked to run a marathon every single day. As the Waterhen prepared for her first run, the crew loaded the cargo. It wasn't just crates of bullets. They loaded drums of high-octane gasoline directly onto the open deck. 1 spark, 1 piece of hot shrapnel, 1 tracer bullet, and the ship wouldn't just sink. It would disintegrate. The sailors walked past these fuel drums, smoking their cigarettes nervously. They knew they were sleeping on top of a volcano. But they also knew that without that gas, the tanks in Tobruk couldn't fight. The scrap iron flotilla was about to become the lifeline of an army, and the Germans were waiting for them. Summer 1941. The coast of Libya, Bomb Alley. The Tobruk ferry was not a battle. It was a rhythmic, industrial process of near-death experiences. For the crews of the Stuart, Vampire, Voyager, Vendetta, and Waterin, time lost its meaning. There was only the cycle. Load, run, unload, run, sleep, if you were lucky. The ships were becoming unrecognizable. The harsh Mediterranean sun and the constant salt spray had stripped away the gray paint. leaving them a mottled, rusty brown. They looked less like warships and more like derelict tramp steamers. But underneath the grime, the crews were operating with a cold, terrifying efficiency. Every run was a gamble with physics and fate. The ships were overloaded far beyond their design specifications. A destroyer is built for speed and stability, not to act as a freighter. With 40 tons of supplies lashed to the upper decks, the center of gravity shifted dangerously high. In a sharp turn to avoid a bomb, the ships would heel over at alarming angles, the railings dipping into the sea, threatening to capsize. And then there was the cargo itself, the Espad Run, as the sailors called it, due to the sacks of dehydrated potatoes they carried for the troops, was a floating bomb. The drums of gasoline were the sailors' constant companions. They sat on the decks, baking in the sun. If a Stuka's machine gun bullet pierced a drum, the fumes would ignite instantly. There would be no damage control, no firefighting parties. Just a flash, and the ship would be gone. The German Luftwaffe knew the schedule. They established what the sailors grimly called the Stuka Parade every evening. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, blinding the Australian gunners with its glare, the Junkers Ru-87 dive bombers would appear. They were terrifying machines, with their cranked wings and fixed landing gear that looked like the talons of a bird of prey. They were equipped with Jericho trumpets, sirens attached to the landing gear struts that produced a high-pitched, bone-chilling scream as they dove. The psychological pressure was immense. The captains Waller, Morrow, Rhodes lived on the bridge. They sat in high chairs bolted to the deck, drinking black coffee, their eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. They developed a sixth sense for the bombs. They learned that you didn't look at the plane. You looked at the black speck falling from it. If the speck stayed in the same place relative to the horizon, it was going to hit you. If it moved, it would miss. On the evening of June 29, 1941, the law of averages finally caught up with the flotilla. HMS Waterin, affectionately known as the Chuk by her crew, was steaming along the coast of Sollum with the British destroyer HMS Defender. The sun was setting. The sea was calm. The lookouts spotted them late. A formation of Stukas, dropping out of the sun. These were not amateurs. They were the experten of the Luftwaffe's desert squadrons. They coordinated their attack perfectly, coming in from multiple angles to split the anti-aircraft fire. Lieutenant Commander John Swain, the captain of the Waterin, barked the order, hard a starboard, full ahead. The old ship leaned into the turn. The Lewis gunners on the rails opened up, a pitiful popping sound against the roar of the diving engines. The first bombs missed. The Waterhen twisted and turned, her wake writing a white signature on the dark water, but the Germans were persistent. One pilot adjusted his dive, anticipating the turn. He released his 500 kilograms bomb. It did not hit the deck. If it had, the Waterin would have vanished. Instead, it hit the water just off the stern quarter. For a modern welded ship, a near miss is dangerous. For a riveted ship built in 1917, it is fatal. The bomb exploded underwater. The hydraulic shockwave hit the Waterin like a giant sledgehammer. The entire ship lifted out of the water and slammed back down. The effect was catastrophic. The rivets in the stern section simply gave up. They sheared off by the thousands, turning into shrapnel that flew through the interior of the ship. The steel plates buckled and sprang open. The lights died. The engines stopped. The sound of rushing water filled the engineering spaces. The Chuk was crippled. She was dead in the water in the middle of Bomb Alley, listing heavily. But the scrap iron flotilla did not leave its own behind. The HM's Defender closed in, braving the remaining aircraft. In a display of incredible seamanship, the British captain brought his ship alongside the sinking Australian destroyer. They passed a tow line. For hours, they tried to save her. They towed the Waterhen through the darkness, hoping to beach her or drag her back to port. The Australian crew worked in the flooded compartments, up to their waists in oil and water, trying to shore up the bulkheads. It was a losing battle. The ship's back was broken. As dawn approached on June 30th, the waterhen rolled onto her side. Captain Swain gave the order, "Abandon ship," and here lies the miracle of the waterhen. She was the first of the flotilla to be lost. She had been bombed, strafed, and broken. She sank in hostile waters. But as the crew stepped off the slanting deck onto the defender, they did a head count. 0 casualties. Not a single man was lost. They stood on the deck of the rescue ship and watched their home slide beneath the waves. It was a heavy, emotional blow. The Chuk was gone. The indestructible flotilla had proved mortal. But the survival of the crew only hardened their resolve. They were scattered to the other ships, the Stuart, the Vampire, the Voyager carrying their anger and their experience with them. The loss of the waterhen marked the beginning of the end for the flotilla's time in the Mediterranean. By late 1941, the ships were physically exhausted. The HMA Stuart, the leader, was in such a bad state that she was practically held together by wire. She was sent back to Australia for a refit, crawling home on one engine, but there was no rest for the others. Because on the other side of the world, a new fire was burning. December 1941, the Pacific. The entry of Japan into the war changed everything. The war in the Mediterranean had been a gentleman's war in comparison. The Italians were reluctant enemies. The Germans were professional. The Japanese were terrifying. They possessed a navy that was, in many ways, superior to both the British and the Americans. They had better torpedoes, better night-fighting optics, and the best naval aviators in the world. HMAS Vampire was the first to face the storm. She was sent to Singapore to join Force Z. This was meant to be the British Empire's show of force. The centerpiece was the modern battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse. These were titans of the sea. The Vampire, steaming in their shadow, looked like a servant escorting kings. On December 10th, 1941, off the coast of Malaya, the Vampire witnessed the death of the old world order. Force Z was attacked by land-based Japanese bombers. The Vampire's crew watched in helpless horror as the unsinkable battleships were torn apart. The Japanese torpedoes were devastating. The Repulse rolled over and sank. Minutes later, the Prince of Wales, the pride of the Royal Navy, capsized. The Japanese pilots ignored the tiny scrap iron destroyer. She wasn't worth the ammunition. When the slaughter was over, the Vampire moved into the wreckage. She was the only thing left floating. She lowered her whalers in scramble nets. Her crew pulled 225 survivors from the oil-slicked water. They hauled admirals and stokers alike onto their rusted decks. As the Vampire steamed back to Singapore, overloaded with the grieving survivors, the reality set in. The shield of the Empire was gone. The Japanese owned the ocean. But the Vampire's own clock was ticking. 4 months later, in April 1942, the Japanese carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, raided the Indian Ocean. This was the same fleet that had destroyed Pearl Harbor. 6 aircraft carriers, hundreds of planes. The Vampire was escorting the small British carrier HMS Hermes off the coast of Ceylon, Sri Lanka. They were alone. At 10:35 a.m. on April 9th, the radio room on the Vampire intercepted a sighting report from a Japanese scout plane. Commander William Moran, the Vampire's captain, looked at the sky. It was a piercing, cloudless blue. There was nowhere to hide. Minutes later, the swarm arrived. 85 Japanese dive bombers. It was an execution. The Japanese attacked with surgical precision. They hit the Hermes 40 times in 10 minutes. The carrier sank like a stone. That left the Vampire alone against the entire air wing of the Japanese fleet. Commander Moran did not surrender. He did not strike the colors. He ordered, hard a starboard, all engines full. The old destroyer, built to fight U-boats in 1917, tried to fight 85 modern aircraft. She heeled over, twisting and turning, her wake scribbling a frantic pattern on the sea. Her gunners, manning the 4-inch breech loaders and the Lewis guns, fired into the swarm. They actually managed to shoot down one bomber, a feat of incredible marksmanship under pressure, but it was hopeless. The Japanese pilots lined up as if they were on a training range. A bomb struck the boiler room. The explosion broke the vampire's back. She stopped dead in the water, steam venting screaming into the air. Another bomb obliterated the bridge, killing Commander Moran instantly. The ship broke in two. The bow sank quickly. The stern floated for a few minutes longer, the propeller rising into the air as if waving goodbye. Mass Vampire was gone. She had survived the Mediterranean. She had survived the Tobruk ferry. She had survived the destruction of Force Z, but she could not survive the rising sun. The flotilla was dwindling. Waterin was dead. Vampire was dead. Stuart was out of action. That left Voyager and Vendetta. And while Vampire died a violent death in the open ocean, Voyager was about to meet a stranger, lonelier fate on a jungle beach. And Vendetta? Vendetta was about to attempt the impossible. September 1942. The coast of Timor. While the Vampire had died a warrior's death in the open ocean, facing the might of the Japanese carrier fleet, this Voyager was destined for a grittier, lonelier end. The war had shifted gears again. It was no longer about fleet battles or protecting convoys. It was a dirty, clandestine war of insertion and extraction in the jungle. The island of Timor, just 400 miles north of Australia, had fallen to the Japanese. But deep in the malaria-choked rainforests, a small force of Australian commandos, Sparrow Force, refused to surrender. They were waging a savage guerrilla war, ambushing Japanese patrols and disrupting their supply lines. But they were starving, their uniforms were rotting off their backs, and they were running out of ammunition. They needed a lifeline. The Voyager was chosen. It was a mission suited for a submarine, not a destroyer, but the Royal Australian Navy had no submarines to spare. So the old scrap iron veteran was sent into the teeth of the enemy. On the night of September 23, 1942, the Voyager crept into Patano Bay on the south coast of Timor. The jungle loomed dark and silent against the stars. The captain, Lieutenant Commander Royston, was nervous. The charts for this stretch of coast were unreliable, dating back to 19th century surveys. The currents were notoriously treacherous. The mission was to offload 400 fresh troops and pick up 600 exhausted commandos and Portuguese refugees. To do this, Royston had to bring the ship dangerously close to the beach. As the Voyager maneuvered in the darkness, disaster struck. A powerful, unseen current grabbed the destroyer's stern and swung it violently toward the shore. Before the crew could react, a sickening grinding noise echoed through the hull. The ship shuddered and stopped. She was aground. Royston immediately ordered full astern. The propellers thrashed the water, kicking up plumes of sand and coral, but the Voyager didn't move. She was dug in. The crew worked frantically, lightening the ship, hoping the high tide would lift her free. But the surf was relentless. Instead of lifting the ship, the waves picked her up and slammed her back down, driving her deeper into the sandbar. As the sun rose over the jungle, the crew realized the horror of their situation. They were a stationary steel target, sitting on a white beach in broad daylight, within easy range of Japanese bombers. The Japanese did not keep them waiting. At 13:30, a flight of bombers appeared. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The Voyager fought back, her gunners firing their Lewis guns until the barrels glowed, but a stationary ship cannot dodge. A stick of bombs slammed into the engine room and the bridge. The old ship didn't sink she couldn't. She was already on the bottom, but she died. Fire swept through the superstructure. The ammunition lockers began to cook off, sending explosions ripping through the hull. Royston ordered the ship abandoned. The crew and the commandos melted into the jungle. That night, they returned to finish the job. They couldn't leave the ship intact for the Japanese to salvage. They set demolition charges in the magazines. At midnight, a massive explosion lit up the jungle canopy. The Voyager, the hero of the Mediterranean, the hunter of submarines, blew herself apart on a lonely beach. Her rusted skeleton would remain there for decades, a steel monument battered by the surf. Now, only two remained. The Stuart was alive but broken, relegated to transport duties. That left the HMAS Vendetta. And the Vendetta was about to become the protagonist of the most impossible survival story of the entire naval war. To understand the miracle of the Vendetta, we must go back to January 1942, to the fall of Singapore. The British fortress of Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, was collapsing under the Japanese onslaught. The harbor was a scene of apocalyptic panic. Burning oil tanks turned the day into night. Ships of every size were fleeing south, carrying refugees to Java and Australia. But the Vendetta couldn't flee. She was a cripple. She was sitting in the naval dockyard, stripped down to her bones for a major refit. Her main engines had been dismantled. Her pistons, massive blocks of steel, were lying on the dockside. Her boilers were cold. Massive sections of her hull plating had been removed. She was a hollow shell. By all naval logic, she should have been scuttled. You don't try to save a 25-year-old broken destroyer when the enemy is at the gates. You blow it up and leave. But the crew of the Vendetta was stubborn. They were scrap iron men. They had survived the Stukas of Tobruk. They had a fierce, irrational love for their ship. They looked at the demolition charges, and then they looked at their captain. "We're not blowing her up," they said. "We're taking her home." Home was Fremantle, Australia, 3,000 miles away. They reassembled the ship in a frenzy, working while Japanese bombers pounded the shipyard around them. They couldn't put the engines back together in time, so they loaded the heavy machinery onto the deck. On February 2nd, just days before the British surrender, the Vendetta was pulled away from the wharf by a tugboat called the ST. She had no power, no lights, no steering. The crew had to rig a manual steering gear and manhandle the rudder. Thus began the long tow. It was a voyage of madness. The convoy crawled at a speed of 3 knots walking pace. They were moving through waters completely dominated by the Japanese Navy. Every time a plane appeared on the horizon, the crew froze, knowing they were sitting ducks. They reached Sumatra, hoping for a reprieve. But Sumatra was falling too. The tugboat ST just had to leave. The Vendetta sat drifting in the ocean, helpless, until another ship arrived. It was the destroyer HM Stronghold. She took the tow line and dragged the cripple further south. But the Stronghold was needed for combat. She would be sunk days later in a heroic last stand. So the Vendetta was passed to the only vessel available, the Ping Wu. The Ping Wo was a character straight out of a Joseph Conrad novel. She was a flat-bottomed, coal-burning river steamer, designed for the calm waters of the Yangtze River, not the open ocean. She was rusty, she was slow, and she belched a column of black smoke that could be seen for 50 miles. The sight was ridiculous. A wheezing, smoky riverboat towing a toothless warship. The heat was ferocious. The steel hull of the Vendetta, without ventilation, turned into an oven. Temperatures inside reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit, 49 degrees Celsius. The crew slept on the open decks, manning the Lewis guns, scanning the sky with paranoia. Every day was a game of Russian roulette. Japanese scout planes flew over them. Miraculously, the pilots seemed to ignore them. Perhaps they thought the Vendetta was already a wreck being towed to the scrapyard and not worth a bomb. Perhaps they were just saving their ammunition for real targets. They reached Java, but Java was collapsing too. A Japanese invasion fleet was approaching. The Pingwo couldn't handle the rougher seas of the Indian Ocean. The Vendetta had to move again. This time, she was hooked up to the HMAS Yara. The Yara dragged her out of the harbor just as the Japanese cruisers appeared on the horizon. The Yara would later turn back to fight and sacrifice herself to save a convoy, going down with guns blazing. Finally, deep in the safety of the Indian Ocean, they met the heavy cruiser HMAS Adelaide. The big ship passed a heavy tow line and cranked up the speed. The Vendetta groaned under the strain, her bow slamming into the waves, but the old rivets held. On April 15, 1942, to 72 days after leaving Singapore, MAS Vendetta limped into Fremantle Harbor in Western Australia. She had traveled 5,000 miles. She had been towed by 5 different ships. She had escaped the fall of 3 countries, Malaya, Sumatra, Java. She was the only ship to escape the Singapore dockyards alive. The dockyard workers in Australia couldn't believe their eyes. The ship was a wreck, covered in rust, barnacles, and soot, but she was home. They refitted her. They put the engines back together, and incredibly, the Vendetta went back to war. She served until 1945, bombarding Japanese positions in New Guinea, acting as a transport, refusing to die. August 1945, the guns finally fell silent. The tally of the scrap iron flotilla was grim but glorious. As Waterhen, sunk off Tobruk. As Vampire, sunk off Ceylon. As Voyager, lost on Timor. HMA Stuart, survived, battered, but afloat. HMAS Vendetta, survived against all odds. Joseph Goebbels, the man who had coined the name, was dead by his own hand in a bunker in Berlin. The master race was defeated. The new order in Asia was dismantled. But the load of scrap iron had helped save the world. These 5 obsolete ships had held the line when the British Empire was on its knees. They had kept the garrison of Tobruk alive for 6 months, denying Rommel the Suez Canal. They had helped destroy the Italian Navy at Maritime. They had fought the Japanese fleet when no one else could. After the war, the survivors Stuart and Vendetta met their final fate. They were sold for scrap. This time, it wasn't an insult. It was the natural end of a warrior. They were towed to the breakers' yards in Sydney and Melbourne. The cutter's torches bit into the steel. The hull plates, scarred by Italian shrapnel and Pacific salt, fell away. But the legend remained. The scrap iron flotilla proved a timeless truth of warfare. It is not the age of the weapon that counts, but the heart of the warrior. German admirals looked at the rivets and saw weakness. They saw inefficiency. They saw a target. The Australians looked at the rivets and saw a job to be done. They saw home. In the end, the floating coffins buried the ambitions of empires. And somewhere in the steel of the modern world in a car chassis, a bridge beam, or a skyscraper there, might still be a few atoms left of the ships that refused to sink.